Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maddie Sides, and along with my partners Matt Higgins and Amanda Brockbank, I'm really excited to share with you the work we've done this quarter on indoor controlled growing in Galapagos, Ecuador. The Galapagos, our partner city. You've probably heard of the Galapagos because of its rich biodiversity, the famous biological experiments that have gone on there, and with this attention has led to a lot of increased tourism and urbanization on various islands. The Galapagos is an archipelago of volcanic islands about 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador, home to, like I said, a World Heritage Site in the Galapagos National Park, but also growing populations and growing cities. Today we're going to talk about the Galapagos food system, and we've distilled what you need to know about the Galapagos food system in order to understand our work into 4 key points. One of those that I alluded to is the growing population and demand for food along with urbanization. The Galapagos is currently experiencing about 6% population growth rate. For comparison, San Francisco experiences about 0.9%. This means that cities are expanding as people move to the islands in search of higher wages in the tourist industry, and larger numbers of tourists are coming every year. This means that the islands need to provide food for all these people, yet they have limited local agricultural productivity. This is because there are restrictions on land use. Only about 3.3% of land on the islands can be used for agriculture, and local farmers cannot use pesticides and have a very limited pesticides and fertilizers, and have a very limited number of crops they can actually grow on the islands. The low wages associated with agriculture on the islands means that many farmers are actually abandoning their farmland and moving to the cities to participate in the tourist industry where wages are more consistent and higher. So to cope with this shortage of local agricultural productivity, about 75% of food is imported to the Galapagos from the mainland on cargo ships multiple times a week. This shipping industry is fruitful for some people in that it provides consistent food sources, although it's associated with a lot of food waste and food spoilage because the port infrastructure is deteriorating and cannot keep up with the stress that this increased demand is putting on it. In addition, importation is also the #1 source of invasive species that come to the island, particularly in fresh produce. And finally, another important prong is the fact that as these islands are a volcanic archipelago, there's very limited freshwater resources, and this must be taken into consideration whenever you're thinking about agricultural or other food-producing activities. This brings us to our partner organization, Plant Lab. Plant Lab is a Dutch company with an office in Palo Alto working to create a technology platform for improved controlled environment growing. This is an example of vertical farming, or basically a system somewhat like greenhouses in which the inputs and outputs of our system are highly optimized to get the most productivity with the minimum inputs in terms of land and water and other aspects. Plant Lab uses an LED-based system to grow a variety of fruits and vegetables along with other staple crops. And here's a little bit about their technology. So the base unit of their technology system is a plant production unit. As you can see, it's a building, somewhat like a greenhouse where plants are grown under an LED light matrix. So this plant production unit is going to be basically the unit that we're going to analyze in terms of the Galapagos. And a PPU turns water, land, energy in the context of a built and electronic infrastructure into fresh, local, diverse, and plentiful food. Plant Lab tells us they can produce almost any kind of crop, and they have different recipes with which to do it. And a PPU can basically be located wherever you want the food to be, as long as you can secure the inputs needed. In the context of the Galapagos, we're looking at a PPU as a technology platform to produce fruits and vegetables, and we'll explain this a little bit more later. So why talk about Plant Lab in the context of the Galapagos? Clearly, we've illustrated that there's a need for, or at least stresses on the current food system, and the government of Ecuador actually came to Plant Lab to explore the idea if their technology might be feasible for implementation on the Galapagos to bring food production back to the islands. And so we're going to explore the ways that we did a model analysis to figure out if this might be feasible.
So as we began to think about whether Plant Lab might be implementable upon the Galapagos and how we might design a model that actually could measure whether it was an effective thing to put on the islands, we really centered around the question of whether Plant Lab technology could play a positive role in the Galapagos food system. Could it ultimately be something that would help the food system in the long run? As sort of sub-parts of that, we realized we had to talk about required inputs of that model, how these inputs would compare to the resource availability on the islands, and then ultimately, what does a PPU implementation strategy look like with regard to all of the variables that we come up with, as well as sociological and economic factors. So then, in order to create this model, we created a framework and we wanted to look at outcomes. So how are we going to evaluate our model? How are we going to decide that we had effectively, Plant Lab was either going to be an effective implementable strategy or not? And we sort of thought about it in terms of two concepts. One, in terms of sustainability, much like we've talked about, in terms of intergenerational well-being. Is this something that was ultimately going to help the Galapagos in the long run and through over time rather than just a one-and-done type of deal? The other thing we thought about was sovereignty, thinking about whether this could help establish food sovereignty for the Galapagos. Since they have such a heavy reliance on importation, is this actually something that's going to help long run for their food sovereignty, and is it effective for that? So we made a couple assumptions when we were building our model. First, we set it in the year 2025. This was an assumption we made because it's about 10 years out from now, which we figured was a good business model and a good sort of timeline when you're looking at a business implementation strategy. We set the demand equivalent to 60,000 people, which we modeled after the year 2025, and then used that in combination with government data about population growth rates and tourist growth rates. So that number takes into account both migrants as well as tourists. So these will be the total amount of mouths that will be needed to be fed in the year 2025. Third, we assumed that Plant Lab would displace imports, not local production. This is for many of the reasons that Maddie talked about with the problems with importation and our goal of food sovereignty for the islands. Additionally, there are a variety of other external factors that could come into play when you're talking about agriculture that seemed more difficult to craft into a model, so we stuck with imports. We also assumed that local production would remain constant. This is a trend that we've seen occurring over the past many years, so we assumed that agricultural production was not all of a sudden going to increase and become vastly more efficient in the next few years. And finally, as Maddie alluded to, Plant Lab would be producing fruits and vegetables only. We felt this was the most efficient use of space, the most efficient use of all of the resources that we would be using. So given that we were looking at demand in 2025 and the needs of the growing population, we thought about what variables that demand might encompass. What was the supply to that equivalent demand? So we thought of these largely in terms of natural resources. So first we thought about land. This is the total growing area and then the percent of total land available for human use, which is limited on the islands. So we wanted to see what impact Plant Lab might have on land. We also thought about energy. Like we said, it's a limited resource community, so we wanted to think about electricity cost and use per capita. We thought about labor, so jobs that might be added. We were specifically advised to think about the economic impacts of Plant Lab, so this was part of our analysis. Shipping, if we're trying to reduce importation, what is the actual effect of that? What is the CO2 emission displacement as well as the cost displacement per capita? And finally, water. Water is limited, so it's something that definitely needs to be kept in mind with the Plant Lab scenario. For these scenarios, we sort of broke it down into 4 different options in order to determine the viability of Plant Lab on the islands and what might be the most optimum situation under which you implement Plant Lab. So we started with 10% of fresh produce imports, moved up to 50, and then 100, and then we also did 100% of the fresh produce imports demanded by tourists only. For method of comparison, this is actually significantly less than 100% of total fresh imports, which makes sense, but we did think that was potentially a scenario in which Plant Lab really could play a role if they were catering to only the needs of the tourists.
Awesome. So that's a little bit about our model, and what we did, we took our model outputs and we used them to evaluate whether or not Plant Lab's technology could be used to play a positive role in the Galapagos food system, be it improving its long-term sustainability or improving the food sovereignty of the islands. So I'm going to show you guys a picture of what our model actually looked like right now. That's a look at what our model is. I show you that just to show you guys that it was a numeric quantitative model. So all of the results that we're going to share with you guys right now are based on a numerical analysis. We're saving you guys from the most of the quantitative, and we'll be discussing mostly on a qualitative basis because we think that's more relevant for you guys, and save some of the quantitative part for our paper. But And additionally, all of the results that we're about to share hold true for even the most extreme scenario of 100% of all fresh produce imports being replaced by Plant Lab. All of the things hold true even in the most extreme case. So taking a look at our results, when you look at the context of how Plant Lab could improve the sustainability of the food system, Plant Lab's technology is a highly efficient use of freshwater resources. So especially compared to other traditional agricultural systems, if the goal is producing food on the islands, is a highly, highly efficient way of doing it. Over 95% water reduction compared to traditional agricultural systems. Also, reducing the need for fresh produce imports goes a long way in minimizing the risk of invasive species, as maritime shipping, especially fresh produce imports, are one of the leading cause of invasive species being brought to the islands. In addition, as Mandy already said, the port system is currently entirely overmatched by the amount of imports, something that's only going to get worse as we move out to 2025. So currently there's under development a lot of plans to construct even new ports or additions to existing ports. So any reduction of importation that we can create is going to relieve stress on the ports and reduce the need for that new coastal infrastructure, which is also going to benefit the long-term ecosystems and sustainability of the islands. Finally, even in the most extreme case, Plant Labs would be using less than 1/10% of the land that's been zoned for human development. So it's an extremely land efficient agricultural system, so land availability turns out to not be an issue for the islands. On the flip side though, looking at some drawbacks, although it is a highly efficient use of water resources, you still are just moving food production from the mainland to the islands, so you are still bringing another water demanding activity to the islands. So you are going to increase the water demand, which is something to consider. However, if the other goal is improving sovereignty, and the goal is a localized food system, this is one of the most efficient ways you can do it. Additionally, they use a lot of electricity, so there is a high energy requirement that also needs to be addressed. The Galapagos actually are one of the more attractive places around the world for Plant Lab in the context of electricity, because the Galapagos are currently in the middle of a new energy policy wherein by the year 2020, the entire energy system of the Galapagos will be local and fully renewable. So they're currently developing a ton of new power plants that provide local renewable electricity generation. So given that Plant Lab technology is going to need a cheap, clean source of electricity, the Galapagos are a great place for them to do it, and there's a lot of potential right now to go in and secure that energy source. A surprise also is that this shift actually provides very little reduction in the way of carbon emissions from food imports, which was a surprise to us. It turns out maritime shipping is an extremely efficient way to get food around. So you actually see minimal reductions in that context. However, as we discussed with the reduction of port stress and the reduction of invasive species, there are other reasons to suggest that port shipping reductions are positive, but in the greenhouse gas emissions, it really won't benefit much. Switching over to the idea of sovereignty, Plant Lab has a huge benefit in that realm. The ability to move food production onto the islands rather than from the mainland is going to greatly improve their resilience to any shocks in the import system, be it port strikes, natural disasters, anything else that might prevent food's ability to get to the islands. In the past, those disruptions have caused incredible price volatility on the islands. So shifting production towards a local system will definitely help resilience and the island's sovereignty. It also is going to put the control of the food system in the hands of people on the islands. So local residents will have the ability to control what gets grown, how much, and when, rather than leaving those decisions to people off the islands. One downside to improving the food or increasing the food sovereignty of the islands is that by sort of closing the food system loop, any negative effects that Plant Lab might have are going to be felt on the islands rather than displacing those externalities to the mainland. For example, our model doesn't address how this technology might affect local farmers, but any negative effects that local farmers will see because of it are going to be felt on the island. Similarly, any changes in labor or the infrastructure of the ports and the shipping industries will be felt on the island. One of the negative effects of closing the loop and making yourself more sovereign is that you also have to deal with the consequences of that. So ultimately, looking at both of those frameworks, our conclusion is it does appear that Plant Lab offers significant benefits, both in improving the sustainability and sovereignty of the food system. However, there are still a few more questions that we would want to get answered that our model was not able to cover before the Ecuadorian government and plant would go on with full implementation. Specifically, it's important that they identify the freshwater resources and energy. There's potential in both of those given the new influx of clean renewable energy on the islands and their high water efficiency, but they still need to secure those. They also should look at how this is going to affect food price on the island and affect the livelihood of local farmers in a more quantitative way. And finally, the reason that this shipping, food system based on imports exists is because it is the most cost competitive. So ultimately, despite any improvements in sovereignty or sustainability, it's going to need to be cost competitive to work. So they need to keep working on getting their costs down. But with that, we just want to thank everyone who helped us with this project. Finally, thank you guys for showing up and open the floor to any questions that you guys might have.
I know you you didn't have the numbers in there, but on the last point, how far are they from being cost competitive?
They won't tell us.
They won't tell you.
Yes.
So they are the closest for fruits and vegetables, mostly because they're higher value crops, and I think most of their research has gone on those, just for, it's more land efficient and things. So that's another reason we focused on those crops.
You don't know their
It's less,
construction costs.
it's less that they won't. It's less that they won't tell us. I think it's still a technology in development, so they didn't want to give us a number that would be different, a month later.
Another one of their goals also is to couple their construction to other things, be it other government projects or anything else to help. So I think construction costs are very variable depending on where construction is happening.
One of the things we did talk about, though, is in terms of cost competitiveness, they do have this sort of nice comfort buffer area of the fact that food prices are double the price on the islands that they are on the mainland. So their cost competitiveness is slightly less than it would be if they were looking at the Ecuadorian market, because people are used to paying more for food, so they have a little bit more buffer room there. But we don't have the exact numbers on that.
Elena?
So do they not have any current greenhouses in operation? It's also being developed?
It's all in their R&D facility in the Netherlands.
They have it in other locations, but not on campus.
I think the point that you made about sort of the link to the need for developing the energy system is really interesting, really critical. Do you have a sense of how many new energy plants of the scale that they're building right now in the Galapagos would be needed, and where the costs get borne for that?
Yeah, so they're currently, I think current plans are calling for 16 megawatts of new, mostly wind and solar, and biodiesel. Their current system is almost exclusively diesel combustion for electricity generation. So in terms of that amount of development, which is happening mostly by the federal government and outside investors, the plant labs demand isn't going to shift that number monumentally. We're not talking an entire power plant. So that's the good news. But because the scale of total electricity infrastructure that they're building right now definitely outpaces the demand that plant labs.
And if you guys have questions, actually, if you want to know a little bit more about the numbers, we have our model pulled up on the computer over here, and when there's a break, you can come check it out. We have the different scenarios outlined and some of the results highlighted.
I'm wondering how much employment this shipping provides and whether that would be absorbed by plant labs.
So it sort of depends on where you place the job. So in its full capacity, Plant Lab would add over 300 new jobs to the islands. So, I mean, taking away shipping at 100% of that imports doesn't take away shipping at 100%, of course, so we're not taking away all the shipping jobs. But it sort of depends, because it depends on where those workers come from. So you could either use those 300 jobs to help take the farmers that now no longer really have an agricultural business and give them the jobs. You could replace it with the people who lost their jobs from shipping. You could do all on island stuff. There's a really, really low unemployment rate on the islands. They're in actually a very unbelievable economic situation, which is part of why they keep having so many migrant issues. So it's really about placement. It's not so much about like losing jobs isn't a big fear for the islands because the tourism has such high demand for the tourism industry.
And that's actually something we're pretty excited about. A lot of conservationists would say that conventional agriculture really has no place on the Galapagos.
Thanks a bunch,
Thanks so
everybody.
much.
Thank you.